commercial theatre is intangibly connected to the commercial development of a nation. The arrival of wealth looted from the supposedly new worlds indirectly led to the golden age of theatre in Spain, in England and in France. To crudely put it, if you like, the achievements of Calderon, of Shakespeare and of Molière, and many of the others besides, were facilitated indirectly by massive theft of resources, for which the genocide of natives of these new worlds and the Africans brought to replace them there, it wasn't considered too much of a price to pay. The new wealth coming from these countries led to the possibility of a working person in the older world to have enough of a disposable income to use, and then also, back then at least, they had the time to use it. So in turn that led to a hunger for time-filling activities. To borrow from some post-colonial theories that go around currently, Caliban carried theatre to its success. Now, the link between commerce and theatre isn't always quite as straightforward as it might appear. Arguably, Ireland's theatre was its strongest when Ireland was at its weakest. The Abbey Theatre's greatest works were before there was even an Irish nation, and the Abbey Theatre's job being to help develop the idea of an Irish nationalism. Brian Friel's biggest plays were about Irish immigration, the attempted stripping of the language and the culture of the land, and desperate poverty. In Philadelphia Here I Come, Translations, and Dancing at Lunasa. None of those were plays that came out at a time of particular affluence in Irish society. They were successful, if you like, at the point of poverty. In contrast, the plays he produced during the Celtic Tiger period, things like Give Me Your Answer Do, a play that I respect greatly, they didn't set Irish culture on fire in the same way. Now, I've already talked about Irish theatre in many ways and how it became an independent and vital thing through its nationalistic roots, but it should also be noted that as long as it was self-stylising as the second city of the empire, theatre was popular in Dublin anyway, particularly in Dublin, but also in Ireland in general. To this day, and in my youth, Ireland was regularly touted as a nation with an above-average theatre-going public. And the most recent report I've seen on that comes from 2018, a survey from the Arts Council of Ireland. But this survey showed that 22% of the Irish public in 2018 were going to the theatre, and a sizable number wanted to go more. This is from a population where only 4% are actively engaged in making theatre as theatre professionals or amateurs. This is in a time of Netflix as well, and a time when Ireland was still returning from a degree of austerity. This gives us a glimpse into why Irish theatre should do so well during times when money's tight and times are hard. There is a thirst for theatre there. We also need to note that the size of the country leads to there being a much weaker tradition in musical theatre. From my upbringing in rural Ireland, the only times when there might be a musical happening locally was either in the local schools, once a year, or once a year when the local musical society would do its annual show. Perhaps, annually a musical theatre production might find its way over from the West End in Britain, and it'll sell out for a week in a massive venue, but that's generally it. We didn't have a tradition of homegrown musical theatre, and certainly no professional musical theatre people left it in Ireland. Most of them travelled to England, like Colm T. Wilkinson. There was certainly a much bigger tradition of variety shows in the form of things like the John Player Tops, which later became the Tops of the Town, or of the Score na Nóg competitions throughout the country. Even in the worst of times, when professional theatre would retreat up to Dublin and we didn't have locally based actors, amateur performances kept strong. Unemployment in 1993 tipped 15%. 15% in Ireland in 1993. It wasn't particularly unusual though, depending on where you were. It could be sometimes worse and sometimes better. The boat to England was the single most common solution, but the figures didn't drop when we lost all those people to abroad. And you could joke that the supply of the theatre world with eager employees was better during the time of mass unemployment, and there is truth in that. In the 80s and the early 90s, there was a lot of theatre work that was, let's just say, underreported. Most of the work in Ireland in that time was underreported. People on unemployment assistance, or the dole as we call it, who might help paint a house and maybe do a day's work on it for £10 or less. They might fix televisions for a few quid here and a few quid there. Child minding, land labouring, unofficial mechanic work, running businesses that didn't actually have a legal existence. Real official jobs were not to be had, so people did what they could. It was kind of the Wild West. Heroin addiction in Dublin was rife. We had gangland bosses with Batman villain names like the Viper, the General and the Monk. Preposterously impossible things that didn't seem plausible happened, both good and bad. In theatre, this meant that you didn't take the gig to get paid, but you might be paid if there was any success, and nobody might need to ever know about it. Credit cards were not the order of the day, and lots of things happened under the table. I don't think in the 90s did I ever pay into it, and I certainly don't think with my parents, did I ever pay into a play with something other than cash. For many in Ireland, in this Ireland, life existed on the margins in different ways. Rents were negligible, but as any money taken in for an otherwise empty warehouse was better than no money, theatres cropped up everywhere. Insurance wasn't a precise science for most companies. Theatre companies I should say, and other companies as well, would come and go. Names would change, the personnel wouldn't, the business model wouldn't change very much, the same people come back. Artists got stiffed, audiences got stiffed too, and the cycle continued. Similar to the impossibility of Yugoslavian economics in the late Milosevic era, the impossibility of theatre in Ireland at this time was what made it vital, also deplorable, but above all, possible. In 1995 and 1996, the poverty that riddled Dublin, the Dublin I lived in, was starting to change. The first clue was people were taking taxis more. Now, initially, many of us thought of it as a bump that came on the back of Dublin winning the All-Ireland football final for the first time in 12 years. And there was this thing that was going around called J.O. Mania. Jason Sherlock, a young and handsome star of Dublin's Gaelic football team, was the man of the hour. So people were spending a little bit more money and enjoying themselves more. We didn't think more than that. Hearing the country then being described as a Celtic Tiger was novel. For me and for most of my friends who were coming to the end of our college days in the mid-90s, our expectation was the boat. This was not anything we expected to change. Even though more money was coming in and we were talking about this Celtic Tiger in 96, at the end of the day, we didn't think it would last any length of time. A year, maybe, 2. But last it did. By the year 2000, unemployment had dipped below 5%, and for the first time, we had net immigration rather than net emigration. For the first time, money became a comparatively easygoing thing. We got better paid from theatre than ever before, and there were more jobs to be had in theatre because there were more people going. They had the money to spend. Some people were less concerned about how much they spent, and even those who were freelance occasionally had the money to buy around once in a while for a change. The price of things, of course, went up, but it seemed fine as people seemed to have the money, and as a result, ticket prices rose too. In 1995, I would have been able to see almost any show in Dublin that I wanted for maybe £5 on student prices. Now, admittedly, at the same time though, top ticket price would have been about maybe 8, maybe 10 for a really big professional show. Within 5 years, student prices were 8 and 10, and the full price ticket was looking like being anything from 12 to 15 to 25. And we're not talking about necessarily for big level musicals. I remember the Ouroboros production of Amadeus in, I think, 2003 was €20, which would be approximately $18.50. This was not the biggest theatre in Dublin, nor was it the biggest budgeted show in Dublin, but you're paying basically an increase in ticket prices of over €10 in less than 10 years. Ticket prices were also not the only thing shooting up. Rent prices were too. For my own house hunting, in 1995, a small bedsit in Dublin could be £20 a week. In 1996, it was 40. By 1997, it was 80, and these prices did not go down. They weren't particularly nice bedsits. They weren't particularly different in standard from each other, but you can see basically a fourfold increase in the space of 2 to 3 years. Property prices also rose. There was a sharp increase coming right as 1996 started, and this bubble didn't pop for 10 solid years, continuously increasing. Now, how does this damage theatre? Let's take 1999 as a peak year for Irish theatre in terms of the amount of work produced, in terms of general employment, and in terms of available spaces. The Project Art Centre had reopened. The space that they'd used was now a new theatre space in its own right called Theatre Space, and still known to many as the Mint. Even to this day, I still call it the Mint, even though it's not been around for years. There were talks of a new Abbey theatre building. There was debate about how many of these old spaces could be turned into art spaces. It was with affluence came this feeling that we should have nice things, and those nice things should include bike paths and art centres. Many of the spaces seem to be in the process of either being built into art centres or being renovated, turned into nicer art centres. There are so many spaces and so many new spaces still appearing. By the end of 2002, this trend had reversed. In the year 2000, Celtic Tiger was at its peak, approximately 15% GDP. The following years, it dropped down to 12 and 11% GDP, which is still pretty good. In 2003, it dropped down to 7% and lower then for the following years, before it really bottomed out in 2008. House prices, despite this, continue to soar. As there's more money involved, theatre is being treated more like a business, with more people paying more attention to the regulations and the legality of it all. And while this is frustrating for most of us, it was definitely for the good. Fewer people were being bilked of the money they were owed. Fewer people were turning up to theatres that weren't going on, even though they'd bought tickets. However, the old magic renaming strategy wasn't as quick a fix anymore. People had to do the paperwork. People had to think about insurance, which for many companies was a new and frustrating cost. You can see the effect of success and how it leads to failure. 2001, the City Arts Centre sells the old warehouse space they'd been in for a number of years, with the view to using some of this money for research before moving into a new place. The research proved to be too expensive. That old warehouse space, they got a fortune for at the time. The price continued to rise after that, and the money was all gone, and there wasn't money left to buy a new arts centre. At this point, everything seemed to cost 2 and 3 times what it did the previous 5 years. This charming old place that I've seen some of my favourite shows in, and the true beating heart of Dublin theatre, was gone. 2001, to people on the American side of the Atlantic, is also a significant year, but it has an impact in Ireland that you do not expect. Unquestionably, what happened in the Twin Towers is a great tragedy, and the world was never going to be the better for it, any part of the world. Aside from the direct and emotional hit, as many Irish have and had families in the US and were working with US firms, there was an unexpected side effect. Apart from the global sense of, ooh, the insurances skyrocketed in early 2002. Insurance rates were guaranteed in the US by the US insurance firms, but those ones who were insuring in Ireland and other small countries were determined to ensure that they weren't going to be damaged by the losses incurred in the New York attack. The underreported side effect of September 11th, 2001 was, and again, in no way on the same scale of the tragedy, but insurance increases throughout the smaller world cost many people their jobs, particularly in the arts. 2002 was also the year that Ireland was the host of the European Union presidency. A very proud nation for a very small country to host the European Union, which would of course bring in a lot of money for the country between hotels, restaurants, catering, and so on. It meant that in the run-up to the presidency in 2001, we had a full 6 months of endless roadworks in Dublin. But it also meant that once we got to 2002, that the local government throughout the country took back buildings that had been practically given over for free to arts organisations. The one that comes to mind particularly is the crypt in Dublin Castle, which was under an old church that's within the grounds of Dublin Castle. It's a deconsecrated church, and so the crypt had been emptied and had been used by Irish theatre for years as a performance venue. Again, many great small companies got their start in there. It was taken back by Dublin Corporation in late 2001 with genuinely sincere sounding promises of it being given back to the use of the arts after the 6-month term was over. Never came back. This happened to other venues around the country. Now, we aren't looking at 20 of them that had it happen to them, but we're still looking at a significant percentage of venues available in Ireland gone without a replacement. Property prices continue to rise, and also so too does maintenance prices. It follows that if you can't renovate your space when everything is starting, everywhere else is looking shiny and new, people aren't going to be as interested in going to it because they're used to shiny and new, and you might be better off renting somewhere else. That is, seeing as people don't want to slum it anymore. Unfortunately, though, many of these theatres that were rented were also proving easy targets for the landlords. The amateur Dublin group, the Olympian Players, had a really fine theatre in their basement, the basement of an old Georgian building, where they and other amateur groups were producing really great work, often with people on their way up the ladder, or maybe taking a break from the professional career to work on a passion project. I remember very well the day that apparently friends of mine and the Olivians went in to rehearse a play that was going up in a week and a half's time, to discover that without warning, the landlord had decided he could make more money from renting it as apartments, and they discovered their set and stage had been put out for the waste collection, and their keys no longer worked. Let's take a step away from property manners and that kind of finance for a moment, and let's look at our flagship theatres, just for a little bit. Now, the Gate Theatre had by this point become increasingly safe, not really planning seasons, instead just importing the big available names from Britain and the US from TV and movies so they could be in high quality productions of popular, well-known American and British plays. Ticket prices, to be honest, were beyond most of us. And it was stable though. And according to people who worked there, the Gate was not a place that focused on workplace safety or security in your work. Meanwhile, the Abbey, which did have security in the work, but no one apart from actors or directors could ever get in or out of it, it was facing into its centenary year in 2004. Ben Barnes had been appointed artistic director in 2000, and he was well known for producing extremely well produced work, which mightn't have been groundbreaking or necessarily the most exciting work to see in Dublin, but always very professional. If you wanted a good read of a play, he would guarantee that for you. Since his time at the Abbey, the period up until maybe 2003, he did some good work. He did some interesting programming. However, the centenary year itself was an absolute disaster from top to bottom. I recall the season starting with, dreadfully disappointing shows that weren't good. And also, it was a dull and unimaginative season that was programmed. The crowd stayed away. I was able to get cheap tickets to many productions, which I wouldn't honestly have been able to do. And then suddenly the theatre was €2.5 million in the red. So there was talk of a third of the staff being let go, and this was announced when the artistic director was in Australia with a show. There was a motion of no confidence made on the back of this, as well as for his failure to include a representative amount of new works, which, if you think about it, it's a crime in the theatre that's claimed its reputation on being the theatre of rioters. He survived to the end of his contract the following year, but departed and wrote a book about it. Even that year's biggest success was The Chakron by Dion Boucicault. It was hugely expensive, very popular, but cost an awful lot to make. And it was given over to a first-time director to direct it, John McColgan, who happened also to be on the board and also major donor. This show, it being in the hands of a first-time director, it wasn't without its criticisms, which is disappointing as your last big chance in your centenary year. Later, we discovered ridiculous things like I think they spent hundreds of thousands of euro on making commemorative diaries, and they purchased them, but they had no one to sell them. So yeah, it was a disaster, and I would say it took the Abbey the best part of 5 years to recover from it. Now, Ben Barnes is doing great things in the Theatre Royal in Waterford and back home living in Wexford and doing great stuff again. The Abbey, it's being run by two Scots, which feels wrong for our national theatre. But, you know, c'est la vie, c'est la guerre. Between 2005 and 2007, a number of other theatres closed, partly because they can't keep pace with property values. To pick two prominent examples, I go back to Theatre Space at Henry Place, which was formerly Project at the Mint. It disappeared without any warning sometime in 2005 or 2006. There was, I remember well, going to see what was on in it and finding after a couple of weeks that there was nothing there. I dropped by. The doors were closed. Meanwhile, Andrews Lane Studio and Theatre, one of Dublin's most vital theatres, and very much an aggressively commercial theatre, it was sold and converted into apartments. Sold to be converted into apartments. But the sudden collapse of the property market the following year in 2008 led to it continuing on as a nightclub for the next 10 years. The bare basics, this is the most money we can make with doing the least amount of work. Before finally it was turned into a pod hotel back in, I think, 2018. Nightclubs were very much the way that things were starting to go from the beginning of the boom. Where once in Dublin, a large open space like a warehouse or a store became ramshackle theatres, putting on ridiculous stuff on Knife's Edge. They're now becoming nightclubs with snazzy names and VIP areas. Some of these places had bigger VIP areas than non-VIP areas. And also in 2007, possibly most damning of all, Trinity College, TCD, Dublin University, whatever you want to call it, they discontinued their acting programme. This has been the closest thing to a prestige acting programme in Ireland for many years. There was a small acting diploma in the Dublin Institute of Technology, and the Gaiety School of Acting did sort of private courses on acting training and different modules, but without any specific cert. The end of acting at Trinity left Ireland with no high-level full-time acting programme. Another degree gone. As often before in so many fields, many Irish were left with no choice but to leave and to seek places abroad. RADA and Lambda in London being famously popular. But there were others too. Some went to France, some went to Italy, some went to Germany. Me? I got out in early 2007 and not before time. I'd seen the financial collapse as inevitable. And while I was as secure as anybody was in Irish theatre, I found myself baffled by the fact that I was still in Ireland when I'd aimed of travelling far beyond our shores. Like all my school friends, like all my college friends, my expectation was I would finish my education and leave the country. I got a job in a theatre space in London and followed that for a few years. I'd continued to return home to do shows as a freelance lighting designer here and there throughout 2007, did a few in 2008. 2008 proved a disaster for Ireland. Slow free fall economically began, and people watched as the rocks of our national success eroded like sand. From an historic low hovering around 4% in unemployment between 2000 and 2007, it had risen to 12% by July 2009, going on to top 16% by 2012. We are only just back under 6% since 2018, the lowest we've been in 10 years. I'm frightened to think where we're at right now. By 2009, I was looking further afield again, and whether that was through funds being depleted or the memory of me fading in Dublin, I wasn't back working freelance in design or directing in Ireland again. My connections were not quite severed, and they still aren't, but my insight to the theatre there, to be fair, is minimal in comparison to what it once was. Many of my old haunts are gone. Several of the theatres and the people who I worked with in them have moved on. The experience of the older Irish emigrants I met since leaving there had been, when I'd emigrated first, that they'd stepped away for a while, grown in different ways to accommodate the new world they were living in, and when they came back found that Ireland had not particularly changed, and found it in some ways difficult to go back to the old world with the new way they'd become. In the case of my generation, particularly those of us who got out before the bad times hit, we changed, but our country had changed too. Back from 2007 through 2010, every time I'd go back, things were changing rapidly. But even more so since things fell in 2008. Tastes differ, experiences are altered. Thanks to the internet, and the very ways of connecting and engaging in theatre have changed too, to say nothing of the places that can be found. And while I can keep in better touch, I'm further and further at a remove. And theatre itself has changed too. More and more people head abroad and they bring the ideas back with them when they come back. The people who came to Ireland in the good times enriched the theatre there, and those who've left have left their mark. But the story of what happened after 2007 isn't mine to tell. It was never my present, and in so many ways it can't be my past.